Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to week 9 of Biblical Interpretations. I hope you're all doing great. My name is James. I'm a husband and a father, and I own an automotive business. And one of these weeks soon, you'll understand why I keep saying the same things over and over and over again. I have a degree in biblical and theological studies, ancient Near Eastern history. Although I'm not an expert in anything. um, so far in this class, we spent the first 6 weeks discussing the foundations of the hermeneutic and epistemological frameworks that I use as we navigate the biblical text. We spent a great deal of time building that framework so that I could say the following and hope that it makes sense. That being, the revelation of God is inherently contradictory. The biblical text describes a God defined beyond all human knowledge that also wants to be known by humanity. The moment that knowledge of God transcends the boundary between what is not known to what is known, that God is no longer transcendent, but rather continuous and defined within knowledge from the perspective of humanity. Thus, it is exceptionally easy for humanity to interpret the knowledge of God as being a God that is fundamentally different than what God wants humanity to understand God to be. So, this is the fundamental problem the biblical text is trying to address. And it carefully tries to walk this line between the known and the unknown, trying to reveal this indescribable God by using knowledge that humans can comprehend, while simultaneously trying to not define God as something different than what God is. This is the primary concern of the biblical text. So the text begins by describing God not as creation itself, like other contemporary mythologies, but rather as the creator itself. And so the first semantical definition ascribed to God in the biblical text is that God is not like any other God because God is the creator. And so this is the problem. How can humanity know God without God being entirely defined by all that is known? How can humanity know God as this without making God into this? And so here we are outside of Eden, epistemologically incapable of not making God into everything. Separated from God, separated from Eden, separated from Sabbath, and as a result, we work. And then we began our mapping journey. We discussed the land in between, the region highlighted in red, the primary setting of the biblical text. We discussed the significance of the Suez Canal today and how its modern usage reflects the age-old historical significance of the trade routes that have always flowed in and out of the land in between. That is, the land in between all the empires and nations. The land in between the land that people wanted. The land in between Egypt and Babylon. We discussed how water is the primary determining factor for where people are and where people go. People follow the water. So our question is this: why is the land in between the setting the text draws attention to post-Eden? I said in the past, one of our hermeneutic assumptions is that there might be more to interpreting meaningful meaning from the text than what the text itself allows us to interpret. We established language as a very obvious subject that can have huge effects on interpreting meaning. But I would also add geography, culture, Western and Eastern thought, politics, trade, economics, the things that are about humanity. These things can these things can potentially influence interpreting meaning from the text. I believe the revelation of God must factor the humanity of humanity into it, or else it can't be understood by humanity. This is the goal. And so we read Genesis 11, and we traced Terah, the father of Abraham, and the route he took along the Euphrates River, going from Ur up to Haran. So I want to make very clear the point of our study. What we are doing is mapping the stories of the patriarchs. And when we do this, we see a pattern develop that gets expounded upon as the text develops. And remember, what is all this about? It's about the revelation of the knowledge of God. And so, after Eden, to me, it just makes sense that right before the story of Abraham, we see this story about his father Terah. The story seems to be this counterpoint to the story of Abraham. And so this was the point. Terah left Ur to go to Canaan. He gets halfway to Canaan, and when he gets to Haran, he stops and he eventually dies in his old age. His legacy is forever remembered as an idol worshiper, not as the patriarch of eventually the world's largest religions like his son Abraham. And so last week, we went over Genesis 12, and we traced the route of Abram from Haran into Canaan, into the land in between. We read, so Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Morah. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there, he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord, and he called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. So then we pulled out map number 2, and we zoomed into the land in between, and we found the cities and regions that Abraham went to. We discussed how the geography of the Levant determines why things are the way they are, why the water is where it is, how the limestone affects the erosion patterns, and determines why the trade routes are the way they are. We started in the west and discussed how the coastal plain is a channel of relative flatlands that runs about 120 miles north to south. How in the north, the coastal plain receives about 25 inches of rain per year, and that number decreases as you head south towards Nahal Besor in the south. Nahal Besor is the border between Canaan and the Negev and the deserts of Sinai. I want to show you guys some pictures of these regions that we discussed last week. A lot of these places are places that we intended to go. And to me, it's the reason why you go visit the land. If you take a trip to Israel or Palestine, the reason you do so is to actually three-dimensionally comprehend how all of this stuff works, because when you see it in person, it's very clear. In the north, on your map, you can see a protrusion coming off the Carmel Mountains that kind of sticks into the Mediterranean. If you were standing on that hill and you looked north, this is what you would see. This is the modern city of Haifa, an absolutely jaw-dropping, gorgeous city today. Truly, Haifa is incredible. Look how the coastal plain wraps around the Mediterranean. With the mountains in the distance, notice the trees down in front of us. I would describe this city as wet and lively. It receives about 20 inches of rain per year, mostly from storms that come in off the sea. If we head about 25 miles south, off the Carmel Mountains, we will reach the Roman ruins of Caesarea. This is a fake man-made harbor built by Herod the Great. The Roman cement, still standing in the water today, is a technological marvel. This picture is looking north towards whence we just came. You can kind of see the ridge of the Carmel way off in the distance in the haze of clouds. The blue marker I put there is where we just were in Haifa. This line here is showing the rough outline of where the coastal plain ends and makes its way up into the mountains. So again, notice the flatness and notice the greenery. It's wet and lively. If we head about 35 miles south of Caesarea, we arrive at the modern city of Tel Aviv, or the ancient city of Jaffa. Today, this is the most populous region with a population of roughly 500,000 people, and it contains roughly 42% of the Israeli population. Again, notice it is flat. It is along the coast. It receives about 20 inches of rain per year. By all definitions of survival, this would be an excellent place to live in the ancient world, and this remains true through today. Notice the mountains way off into the horizon. I know it's a little hard to see on the screen, but they're there. If we continue about 80 miles south of Tel Aviv, we reach the area of Gaza, which is where Nahal Bezor flows into the Mediterranean. This area receives about 2 inches of rain per year. In the winter, the Nahal might be flowing with water and reach the sea. In the summer, it'll be dry and dead. If you see grass, it is wintertime or the rainy season. It is also flat, but it is very dry. And so, the international trade routes to and from Egypt are down on the coastal plain. The primary people on the coastal plain were travelers, people coming and going, passing by on their way to the big cities. Lots of trade value coming in and out, lots of goods to tax. And the locals are up in the hill country, trying to stay alive, trying to stay out of the way of the strange foreigners that move through the coastal plains, the people who have no interest in your existence. So as long as you stay up in the hills and stay out of the way, you should be good. We're talking, I don't have it in front of me. I think it's 2400 BC. But really for up till the fall of Rome, I would actually argue it's still true to this day. But so the coastal plain are where the cats are, the big players, the high rollers. The next region we discussed was the hill country. If you're in Tel Aviv and you head due east about 30 miles, you would go from sea level up to about 3,000 feet. The region receives 20 to 40 inches of rain per year during the winter rainy season. This is the primary region of the locals of Canaan. If you were a Canaanite, this is the primary area in which you lived. And you were a mouse up in the hills, trying to stay out of the way and not get trampled by the Egyptians and Persian cats down on the coast. If we start in Beth Shan, which on our maps we highlighted and is just south of the Sea of Galilee, we start in Beth Shan and we look southwest. You can see the start of the hill country. Beth Shan is the northern gate into the hill country. This is a picture from the top of Beth Shan looking south towards the hill country. You can see the land rise up in the photo. From here, if we head about 25 miles south, we go up into the hill country and we come to Shechem. At Shechem, we're at 1,800 feet. And we will remember when Abraham first enters Canaan, this is where he comes to. Notice the hills and the valleys. Notice the greenery. This region receives about 20 inches of rain per year. This is what the hill country looks like. If we continue 20 miles south, we arrive at Beth El or Bethel or House of El. Notice the rocky terrain. We are now at 2,800 feet, and this area receives about 30 inches of rain per year. The limestone is soft, erodes easily, and with the rain, it accentuates the peaks and the valleys. Notice today where the houses are, on the tops of the hills. From here, we continue south. And so now, even though this next city does not matter at all, this is as good of a time as ever to show you Jerusalem. This picture is a painting from 1870 by the American artist Frederick Church. We could talk a lot about Frederick Church in the School of Art from which he arose and its influences on America and Manifest Destiny. I highly recommend speaking to my wife on these matters. But we're not going to get into that, but it's fascinating. This painting is one of my favorites. This painting is from the perspective of the Mount of Olives, looking down into the old city of Jerusalem. Notice I said looking down. That'll be important to note in a future class. And Rachel is related to the question you asked me earlier. Jerusalem as a whole doesn't look much different than Bethel or Shechem. These rolling hills are the overall theme and vibe of the hill country. It's why it's called the hill country. From here, we're at 2,700 feet, nearly the same height as Bethel. However, Jerusalem has an annual precipitation of about 20 inches, 10 inches less than Bethel, only 8 miles away. Why? Because Jerusalem cradles on the Rift Valley, the rain shadow, and the Judean wilderness. As you head east, the rain drastically decreases into the Rift Valley, into the Dead Sea. From Jerusalem, keeping south 20 miles, we skip past Bethlehem. We go all the way down the southern gateway into the hill country, and we find the city of Hebron. Hebron is situated at 3,000 feet. It's the southernmost major city at the peak of the hill country, with an average annual rainfall of about 20 inches as well. From here, we continue south. We go 25 miles, and we drop from 3,000 feet to 850 feet. And we end up at the southern main gate at Beersheba, the capital of the Negev. This region receives only 7 inches of rain per year. All of these cities we had highlighted last week, and several of them we underlined in red because they're the gate cities. So this route we just traced through the hill country, this is the route of the locals in and out of the hill country. This is called the Ridge Route. And we see this is the same route Abram takes in Genesis 12. We then discuss the Shephelah, the land in between the land in between. The Shephelah is characterized by steep valleys that run east and west, creating fingers that are trying to bridge the elevation gap between the hill country and the coastal plain. Because of the erosion patterns, the trade routes in the Shephelah only run east and west, not north and south. And so, because of the east-west valleys of the Shephelah, there are natural cities that are of defensive importance for the protection of the hill country and the coastal plains. The vast majority of the battles we read about in the Bible, like in the books of Kings, Chronicles, Judges, are all about the mice trying to defend against the cats coming up the valleys. Stories like Samson and King Saul and David and Goliath. A lot of these stories are representative of the struggles for control of the gated cities on the east-west axis points in the Shephelah. We could take the time to map a story like David and Goliath. And in doing so, it becomes very obvious and self-explanatory from a political perspective why that story happens and why it happens where it happens. This is a picture of what is most likely the spot the story of David and Goliath happened. You can see in the red the Elah Valley, which runs east-west through the Shephelah. The tops of the ridges come down from the hill country, and the bottom of the valley comes up from the coastal plain. So the fortified cities are where they are because they protect the access points in and out of these valleys. And where the fortified cities are is where the battles happen, which is why the stories we see in the text concerning these matters are in the text to begin with. And so this is why the Shephelah is the land in between the land in between. We then jumped east to the lowest point on Earth, over to the Rift Valley, with the Dead Sea at minus 1,412 feet. The hill country is at 3,000 feet above sea level, and roughly 25 miles away is the lowest point on Earth, creating a drop-off of over 4,000 feet in 25 miles. Here is the Dead Sea. It receives less than 2 inches of rain per year. So think about this. This picture in Jerusalem is only 25 miles away from this. It's the distance from where we are here to downtown Minneapolis. And so with the steep elevation differences between the hill country and the Rift Valley, it creates a rain shadow. And this area is called the Judean wilderness. And like the Shephelah on the west of the hill country, the wilderness is a natural barrier on the east, but it is even more intense, even steeper. The rifts and the canyons run east and west, and because of the rain shadow effect, this area receives only 4 inches of rain per year. There are no trade routes north-south through the wilderness, and trade is very limited east-west, but feasible. But you gotta work your ass off.
Yeah.
Here we see the rain shadow behind Jerusalem. This is the Judean wilderness. Jerusalem sits right on the edge of the rain shadow. Literally, as soon as you leave Jerusalem, if you head east, you are immediately in the wilderness. So from here, we keep moving east, and we arrived at the Transjordanian Mountains. The Transjordanian Mountains are the last sign of water and life as they rise up out of the Rift Valley and into the Arabian Desert. And so we see our geographic regions: the coastal plain, the Shephelah, the hill country, the Rift Valley, the Transjordanian Mountains, and Arabia. These regions are then capped in the north by a 10,000-foot mountain called Mount Hermon. And in the south, we have the Negev Desert. And so we concluded our geographic regions determine where the water is, which determines how the land erodes. which determines where the trade routes are, which determines where the cities of importance are, which determines why we read the stories we read in the text. We can see the majority of the trade happens north-south across the coastal plain, the hill country, and the Transjordan. And that's what led us to this. So we mapped the 3 trade routes: the route of the cats along the International Coastal Highway, also called the Via Maris. It runs up through Megiddo and Hatzor. The route of the mice, the local route called the Ridge Route, running down from Beth Shan through the hill country, down through Hebron, and out to Beersheba. And we mapped the Transjordan route, running along the ridges of the Transjordanian mountains. The route with no access to water, where you probably had to have a very good reason to take this route. Then we mapped a few of the east-west routes that cap off the 3 main routes and highlighted all the strategic gated cities that controlled access in and out. And our completed map then looked like this. So this is the area where probably 70% of the entire biblical text is situated. And it fits within the state of Minnesota like three or 4 times. So from there, we mapped Abraham's journey outlined in Genesis 12, and we came up with this. And so for those of you who don't know, green is always the routes of patriarchs or Israelites. The green lines that we draw on our maps are usually representative of the stories in the text. So we saw Abram left Haran. When he gets to Damascus, from there he likely traveled south on the Transjordanian Highway. He crossed the Rift Valley and headed up into the hill country, and he stopped at Shechem. And at Shechem, he built an altar. And God says, "This is the place your descendants will inhabit." Then he moves south along the ridge route to Bethel and Ai. He stops, he pitches his tent, and he builds an altar. He then proceeds south down the ridge route and exits the hill country at Beersheba and goes into the Negev. And so our big recap is Abram spent his life in the lush, wet, fertile Euphrates River Valley. He leaves Ur with his father Terah. They stop in Haran and pause. Eventually, Abraham leaves Haran and heads to Shechem. It's 400 miles from Haran to Shechem, and probably took at least a month to make the journey. And he arrives at Shechem. He makes an altar to God. God says, "This is the land of your descendants." And then immediately there's a famine, because that's exactly what you would expect. The question is why go through all the trouble to get to Canaan, to immediately leave and head to Egypt? The text says, "Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land." If you haven't been paying attention, you'll notice how big of a deal water is in the land of Canaan. It is so predictable that the land would have a famine, because that's what the land does. Because it requires rain for survival, unlike Mesopotamia and Egypt, which gets its food from the flooding of their rivers. So, of course, Abram goes to Egypt. There's nowhere else for him to go. And so this was where we left off last week. So now we'll continue our journey. Let's take out map number 1. So take a green marker You should have Shechem highlighted in yellow. It should be circled in green, I believe. And we want to draw a green arrow going from Shechem to Beersheba. So it should look like this. It's just going to be a small green arrow. Yeah, absolutely. Right here we've got, yep, so right here is Shechem. You have to circle that. And then down here we have Beersheba. Well, we just want to draw an arrow between the two. So now from Beersheba, or Beersheba, Sheba, on the map it's a B. It's, yeah, right. So from Beersheba, draw an arrow from the south, going southwest through the Sinai. We'll go across where we've got the Suez Canal drawn, and we want to draw an arrow over towards Cairo. So it'll look like this.
You know, it's probably lost on the people actually.
We've got Cairo, Memphis, Yep.
Have you ever been?
To Israel?
Yeah.
I have.
Never been even close to this region.
We did a trip in
I didn't go with you guys.
The connection was, I thought it was like when you had gone with before, and then our church went. No.
I had wanted you guys to go with the same person that I had gone with. I had in high school. I had went with John Ferret.
Yeah. We didn't. I thought we didn't go with us, but we definitely did classes leading up to it with him.
Maybe, I don't remember. I just remember when you guys went, I couldn't go with you, and so I didn't. But
when he took his class, he didn't physically come.
Okay. So now Abram is in Egypt, and we read in Genesis 12 the following. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land, no duh. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarah his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful, and when the princess of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she was my sister? So that I took her for my wife. Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. And Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. So now we want to draw a green arrow in the opposite direction. We want to go from Cairo back up to Beersheba like this. And then from Beersheba, we want to go back up to Shechem like this. And now we read. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, that is Eden, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. I will make arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So now let's set map number 1 aside and take out map number 2. So on this map, we had left Abram in the Negev. Yes. Yeah, map number 2. Oh, this one. Yep, this is the correct one.
I took us there with educational opportunity.
So we left Abram in the Negev on this map. So now we want to make a green circle and kind of watch this before you do it. But we'll make a green circle around Hebron, southward into the Negev like this. We want to kind of circle that region. Yep, kind of going up and around Hebron and then just down into the general direction of the Negev. Yeah. Yep.
3,000 feet.
Yep. Let's see. So you're at Hebron, so I would just do kind of a big circle, kind of going like this. Sure, that's no problem. We can go like this. Hebron is
Oh, no.
This way.
Hebron, but you said something else.
the Negev. It's called this region down here is called the Negev. We're trying to just create a general sense on where Abram spent most of his time. So now we want to draw an arrow from Beersheba southwest towards the Sinai Sands and point the arrow west like this. And now draw the inverse, an arrow coming from the west into Beersheba and the Negev like this. And then you can label between those lines, just write to and from Egypt. Okay. So now find the Dead Sea. And if you look directly south of the Dead Sea, not very far, but we're looking for the village of Zoar. We want to highlight Zoar.
No, this one looks more green.
Oh, it does the limeish. I got you. So Zoar is like a region, or
It's a village. We're highlighting it because the text we just read says that that's where Lot goes. It is a very low spot. Hebron is 3,000. Beersheba is like 800. So that spot there, it might even show on the map. I'm not certain.
Zoar would probably be a little sea level, pretty close to, or
No, it's at the Dead Sea. I mean, it's probably below sea level, but it's at the bottom of the Transjordanian Mountains. So the text that I had just read, basically, it's interesting because you see this story where Abraham and Lot are in the Negev, and they're like, "This land can't sustain us." So they're like, "Pick where you want to go," and Lot picks the east side of the Dead Sea along the Transjordan because there's more water there. And the text compares that region liken to Eden or like to Egypt. And so then Abram ends up with Canaan by default.
Which is this.
Correct.
It's not as nice.
Not even close.
and
It
it's
was
got
like,
a waterfall.
that guy picked the watering spot. I'll just stay here in the desert.
Yep.
Like when we were there, we went to the waterfall, and it was a beautiful, like, almost like, also you see palm trees, and it's just like an oasis in the desert.
Okay, so now we'll take an orange marker, and from our circle of the Negev, we want to draw an arrow over to Zoar like this. So if when we're reading in Genesis, you come across a story. There's a whole lot in Genesis about what happens to Lot and his lineage. You read about his son. He has a son named Moab, and eventually that entire region of the southeast corner of the Dead Sea in the Transjordan, that area is known as Moab. And throughout the biblical text, you'll see that word and the people mentioned there, the Moabites. It comes up pretty much from Genesis onwards, but that's why. Correct, the descendants of Lot's. And all of those genealogies are established in Genesis. Okay. So we read in the text a few things. One, the land can't sustain both Abram's family and Lot's family, which is, again, no duh. There's just not a lot of resources to go around. Abram allows Lot to pick where he would like to settle. And Lot picks the Transjordan because it's green like Eden, green like Egypt. This implies Canaan is not green like Eden, and it is not green like Egypt. And again, I want to just iterate. This is a theme that will become repetitive, because that's the point. And so we see here our first major split in the family storyline that leads to separate geographical focuses, claims, and lineages, the effects of which that I think we still see today. We can't possibly map everything that we read in Genesis as much as I would like to, and I can't possibly try to expound upon everything we're reading as well. This passage I just read a little bit ago involving Abram when him and Sarah are in Egypt. I'm not really going to focus on that story a whole lot, but we might come back to it because, again, one of the things that I'm trying to do is focus on spots in the text where we see the stories repeat themselves. And what you find is as the generations develop, the same things happen to all of them. And that, from a hermeneutic standpoint, is a textual clue about trying to place emphasis on something. And so what happens to Abram happens to Isaac, happens to Jacob, and so on and so forth. And these are the patterns that we're trying to pay attention to. So in general, in this class, I'm trying to put focus on the patterns. I'm not trying to stand in front of you and tell you what they mean. I'm kind of am, but not maybe in a way that you might like. So because of that, there's just certain things I just have to skip over. So take that for what it's worth, but we're going to continue on. And so after Genesis 13, we see the separation of Abram and Lot, and we'll skip over Genesis 14 because we don't have time. And we come to Genesis 15, and we read, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to Abram. This man shall not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. And Abram believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. And Abram said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And Abram brought him all these things, cut them in half, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half, and when birds of the prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. All the ites. Yeah.
One man to be told, I give you the land of all these other people. Aren't we supposed to respect other people and be our brothers and sisters? How is he going to go there and take all their land?
You're in theological line, yeah.
I am not going to answer that. What I will say is, I've said at the introduction of every class, I've said that I believe one of the key things that the Bible has to do is factor in the humanity of humans in order for it to mean anything. There's this concept in Judaism that like Christianity does not believe in. And it's this idea that the text is a compromise. That what we might read in the text is not actually the ideals of God themselves. That is something that I actually do kind of believe. I think some of the things we might read in the text are rationalizations of behaviors of humans, not necessarily what God intended. And in this class, I'll actually give farther and farther evidence of that. And that's kind of a thing that we're getting into. But the point being, I would say, yeah, just I don't really have a good answer for that other than that's what humans do. And we just read an example of that. You've got Abram and Lot are both like, this land can't sustain us. It's like the text is trying to take that into account, right? That it's not possible for everybody to just coexist in one spot. Whether God is just like, hey, go and take these land from these people, to hell with them. I don't think I have to I don't try to go there basically in my thought process, because that's, at the end of the day, that's not what the text is actually concerned with trying to answer. Okay, it just assumes that that's what people do, and that is what people do, and that's always what people have done. Hmm.
Well, there is a history of genocide in this country. We don't have to really be that way towards each other. In fact, there's a point at which the British people tried to have that 1763 Proclamation Act that the white settlers shall not go across the Mississippi River. And I recently read that that may well be why we had a civil war, not because of slavery, but because the white people who had money and had slaves wanted to be able to have plantations going across the country. So they didn't want to be blocked from going across the Mississippi River. But the other way is that you can have the Jeffersonian style of living and you have small family farms and you're not trying to do everything with slaves. And his idea was, and of course Jefferson had slaves himself too, but the Jeffersonian ideal is to have small family farms.
Right.
I think what I'm trying to get at is that there's different ways to present it. So maybe that's the way it was written, and maybe that's the right translation, but it certainly doesn't seem like the most socially smooth way to talk about migration.
I think I guess what I'm about to say might be a little harsh, and so I don't by any means want to like diminish the sentiment of what you're expressing, but I think that those sentiments are us in our modern day trying to rationalize something that just looked very differently. I mean, for example, one of the things clear in the text that the behavior of Abram is that of a Bedouin. It's a type of people group. They lived in tents. We've already read multiple times. He pitches his tent. He pitches his tent. They're nomadic. The very idea of land ownership, for example, in the Middle East, is entirely different than how we think of it here, even to this day. It's completely different. So it's just, to me, there's not a good way to come up with just a like one size fits all answer to the question you're getting at. It's a different time. It's a different place. You had to do things to survive, right? The mentalities were different. Even the idea of land ownership is different. It's just different. Well, absolutely that too. And so I've read some of the archaeological consensuses, for example, of what did Canaan look like roughly around the years that we would expect Abram to have been there. Like we're talking about an area with a population of maybe a couple thousand people, right? It's not. Let's just put it this way: what we're reading in the text, okay, in its setting, is not the same thing as what we're talking about today of Israel, Palestine, and what's happening with the wars there today. Right? Just population alone, exactly, right? But it is, to me, interesting that even as far back as this text, we already have an instance of the notion of, hey, this land can't support all of us, which is interesting. And it's like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you what that means, but I am saying that's an interesting thing to take note of.
And this is an example of a warning right here. There's enough energy and balance here for are two families.
Right. Yeah, Rachel.
I just have a clarifying.
Yeah.
Are all of the ites that were listed, are those the people groups in this green circle on the map?
Nope.
No.
Yeah. So that text that I just read at the end there, kind of that last verse, like, to your offspring I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, yada 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 yada. The scholarship on that text alone is interesting. There's a lot of debate about. I mean, most people, you read that and you think, oh, the river of Egypt, right? It says that God is giving Abram the land all the way to the river of Egypt. And you read that and you think the Nile, right? Right. Exactly. Okay. The problem is, it's like at no point anywhere throughout the rest of the biblical text is there any sentiment at all of the descendants of Abraham taking actions with the assumption that they will conquer Egypt. It never even comes close to happening. Okay, so some people might say, it could be that this mention of the river of Egypt is actually the Nahal we have highlighted there, Nahal Besor, because that was the ancient border between Canaan and Egypt. So like there's scholars who have suggested that maybe this text is actually talking about the southern border there, right? And so these are some of the things that's like, I'm not going to sit here and say this is the answer. What I'm saying is every one of these words you could spend absurd amounts of time on trying to just dig into the research on and trying to go, what is this? What is this? What is this? And in my opinion, the more you try to find an answer on these things, the less clear cut everything actually becomes, I think, I read this and I go, I want it to be about Canaan. That's my hermeneutic. I want it to be about Canaan because it, to me, solves a lot of the problems. But even though that's what I want, it doesn't mean that that's actually what the text is saying, or that's even what it means. I just personally am like, I don't have a good answer to that question. All I do know is I think it's absurd, historically speaking, to be like, oh, hey, God told Abram that his descendants would conquer Egypt, and then they never did. So therefore, this whole thing doesn't mean anything, right? It's like, no, I refute that. I think that there's something else going on here, and that's kind of that piece. Is I do tend to agree more with a Jewish thought, of the text is much more about humans, and it's a compromise. This is not expressing the ideals of God. This is expressing what humans did and how God reacts to it, right? So I don't know. It's a tough conversation. Take all that for what it's worth, but we'll yeah.
You can explain why he cut all the animals in half and
Nope.
Okay.
Nope. If you want to know that, so the passage there about the animals being cut in half has been, you can find any pastor in the world will talk about that, and I say have at it. I'm not going to spend time on that right now.
Is it weird you did that, or that's like something people just know rituals know?
I don't think it's weird at all.
Yeah. I said if it was brought up as like he did a weird way of sacrifice versus like no, people who just know sacrifice rituals.
I would like to in this class talk about some, I don't know. There's not, for what we're trying to do, that's not a good spot to do it. But one of the things I encourage everybody to dig into is, in our Western world, when we read the text and we come across things like sacrifices, we entirely separate the idea of a sacrifice from basic survival principles regarding food. They're separate things in our eyes, but that's just not the case. So slaughtering an animal for the purposes of a sacrifice, as you read in this text, is not abnormal. And that to me, kind of going down that train of thought of the connection of sacrifice and food, is to me the starting point to answer the question that you just asked. It depends, and again, that's a whole different. There's, I think there's a spot where we'll actually have to deal with that, but yeah, yes, yep, you're good.
Better understand that it goes way back here to this point in time. Okay, in other words, what's happening there today, tracing it way back to humanity.
Sure, yeah. I think it's evolution. It's like this is what humans do. You could pick an arbitrary point on the planet, and you're gonna find the same histories. So, right, and that's why I get frustrated. You go on TikTok and you see people like, oh my gosh, the Bible's dumb because it has all these things in it, and every time I just be like, do you just expect it to not just address the fact that humans exist? It's like this is what people do. What's interesting is not the fact that the Bible is like, hey, we're going to just have these long passages that are just very, like the lineages, the genealogies. Most people don't even read them, but it's interesting because it's like what's interesting is not the fact that the genealogies are there. You'd expect it to be there for what the book is about, right? If it wasn't there, to me it would mean less, right? So what's interesting is not the commonalities, it's the differences. It's the points in the text where you see something that is entirely different than what would the normal thing be for a human to do, like Abram leaving Ur. That's not normal. This journey we've mapped is not normal. You don't leave a place like Ur and go to a place like Canaan and then get there and immediately have a famine and leave again. It's total nonsense. It doesn't fit with what you would expect of human behavior. Does that make sense? So it's the differences to me that matter. What?
That's it for both of kids. 5-minute warning.
Oh, okay.
Both
Quick,
Joshua.
go.
Yeah. So yeah, we will continue on. I don't have any more mapping tonight, so you're not going to miss it. Pretty much the rest from here is just me trying to expound upon that verse that I just read. So I just read this whole passage, Genesis 15. You can read more of that on your own, but these are just kind of my thoughts on it that I think is what we're trying to draw attention to. And so with this passage, what we find is for the first time since Eden, God reveals something about who God is. Who God is the God that brought Abram out of Ur. So who is this God? This God is this God is not the God of Abram's father Terah, because Terah didn't leave. So it's the God who brought Abram out of Ur, and not the God that didn't bring Terah out of Ur, or Harana, basically. Anyways, so the point is this. If Abram is possessing the land of Canaan, then Abram knows God. Okay? Up on the screen, I got at the bottom. Oh, Lord God, how am I to know I shall possess it? And God says, because you possess it. Because I'm the God that brought you out of the Chaldeans, out of Ur. So if Abram is not possessing the land, then Abram does not know God. And this is the difference between Abram and Terah. Going back 2 or 3 weeks ago, when I was asking that question, this is why. The differences between Terah and the differences between Terah and Abram that Abram goes to Canaan. So being in the land of Canaan is how you know God. You can't know God being in Ur. To me, that is what I think these whole passages in Genesis is trying to express. There's a connection between the idea of Canaan and the idea of Eden. Nope. No. I think, and I think that's another one of those instances where there's such a huge difference with how we think about these things. No, I'm not saying you have to be in Canaan to know God. I'm saying the text is saying that Abram had to be in Canaan in order to know God.
Why would he have to be there?
Because God told him to go to Canaan.
I believe that. I believe what you're saying. I know.
And so you can't know God if you're in Egypt. You can't know God if you're in Ur. You know God if you're in Canaan. That's what we're seeing with the story of Abram. We're in Genesis. We have the entire Bible we could go through to try to answer that question. So I'm not trying to answer that question right now. And I would say I'm not going to answer that question. To me, there's a framework here that we're trying to establish that I think insinuates answers to that question. But I'll go back to, we just emphasized, I said, there's the first point in the text where you see this split happen. You've got Abraham going one way and you've got Lot going another way. That's all I'm going to say about that right now, but it's a point of emphasis. Because if we go back to our first few weeks where we go through this idea of epistemology, when I was talking about home runs, like the history of home runs, right? To me, it's the same idea. Is from this moment where Abraham and Lot split, we've got thousands of years of that split continuing to happen. And at every point there's a split, the question should be, why? Right? And the text talks a lot about a lot of those points. Okay? To me, whatever the answer is for a question like that is to be found in studying the points where these splits happen. And again, that's really all I feel like I can say about it, but we'll kind of get into some of that, but maybe not as in depth as we should. But
Anyway, I saw too was Abraham was drawn out. He was drawn out and then into this land over here. So too Moses was taken from here and put into the basket, into the water. He was drawn out. God showed me something having to do with those similarities. Mm-hmm. Moses taking out because that's what he could be used. Abram being taken out.
Into
a new area because that's what he could be used. Maybe that's the wrong language to use. So I'm trying to think of adjectives and adverbs somewhere. Holy, Holy, define what I'm trying to say, but I think you catch the drift thing.
Absolutely. You are tapping into the point. Absolutely. So it's as if the text is preemptively trying to answer the question. It immediately says this. So Abram knows God because God brought Abram out of Ur to possess the land. And Abram knows he will possess the land because he will die in the land. But his offspring will leave the land and come back. That's what this whole passage says. And Abram believed, and he was righteous for that belief because it hadn't happened yet. So the proof of the belief hadn't happened yet. So when Abram leaves Haran and goes to Canaan, it's not until he's already there that God tells him, I'm the one that brought you out of Ur, brought you here, and this is why. So the action happened before the result. Okay? And so I think that is the primary distinction between Torah and Abraham. I read from the Jewish Midrash a couple weeks ago, and I think it's expressing this idea that Torah wanted the results before he would take the action, because of the death of his son in Haran. Abraham does the action of leaving Ur to go to Canaan without knowing the results of doing so. So righteousness, I'm quoting the text here, okay? Righteousness is the action of the belief without knowing the fruition of the results. Your actions are the proof of the belief. The result is not the proof of the belief. In other words, the motive for what you do is in doing it, not justified by the result. And this is a theme that we see develop throughout the text. God says, do this. And the people say, well, we won't do it unless we know we won't die. And God says, it's the act of not doing it that is what will kill you. So you see, this is what the fundamental difference is between living in lands of Ur, Egypt, and Canaan. There is a certain guarantee to the preservation of life that Egypt can afford you that Canaan simply cannot. So if you're in Egypt, you can't know that your belief in God's sustenance for your life is actually coming from God, or if it's coming from something like the Nile, which is why it's so easy to make God into this if you're living in Egypt or Babylon. And it is so easy to make the Nile God. It's much easier to do that than it is to know this God. And this is, to me, why God is like, go to Canaan. So Abram asks, how will I know? And God says, you won't see the proof. But then we should ask, who does see the proof? And we read a little bit later in the text, and we come to the story of Isaac, and we read this. It says, now there was a famine in the land, which again, no shit. This is what it does. This is the point. Why is there a famine in the land? Right.
More people than food.
The desert. You've been to the brain a year.
So, and in case you're wondering, this is not the same famine that Abraham experienced. I love this. The text says there's a famine in the land, and then immediately it says, and also, this is not the same famine that Abraham experienced. This is a different famine. Because, there's so many freaking famines that we have to distinguish between which generation of famine we're talking about. That is why they're in Canaan. And so, what do you think Isaac does? If we learned anything in this class, where do you think Isaac goes? Not Egypt. And it says Isaac went to Gerar, not Egypt. So again, I even said it a little bit ago. To me, it's the patterns and the differences that matter. So in case you're thinking then that Isaac's going to get some funny business and just hike on down to Egypt anyways, the text also deals with that. And it says God explicitly tells Isaac not to leave the land he is in, not to leave a famine, not to go find a place with food. He's better to stay in the freaking desert. So why does God tell Isaac not to go to Egypt during the famine? So we read, this is the full passage. Do not go down to Egypt. Dwell in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and to your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give your offspring all these lands. And in your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So Isaac gets to live in the land all of his life. He experiences the results that Abraham did not get to see. As far as I can tell, until sometime after the book of Joshua, Isaac is the first and last descendant of Abraham to be born in Canaan and die in Canaan without having ever left. And so the conclusion of Abraham's decision to leave Ur was only proven to be true by the fact that he died and was buried in the land. But the promises God made to Abraham were not to the benefit of Abraham. Abraham did not know the proof. He only had enough faith to act. So what is the goal here? Or what is a goal? That's what I'm asking. What is a goal? A goal is the object of a person's ambition or effort. In other words, it's I want X thing to happen. I want to have a 20% increase in profits in my business next year. Often our frame of thinking in Western thought is the belief in a goal dictates our action. It's my belief in a desired outcome that determines my actions. This is the goal-oriented mindset. It is taught throughout nearly every facet of our society today. Especially as a business owner, I've been exposed to this sort of thinking a lot. It infatuates entrepreneurship through and through. You'll see this in manifestation mentalities of just manifest what you want and focus on that, and it'll happen. I have a belief and a goal which determines my actions. The action is the outpouring of the intended goal. The focus on the goal is what makes the goal happen. This is a very different frame of thinking than what we see in the story of Abram's sojourning to Canaan. What we see in Semitic thought is more like this. It's the belief in what you do that determines the goal or the outcome. The goal or the outcome is fixed based on the input. The goal is the byproduct of any given action. It's not that the outcome doesn't matter. It's that the primary force of belief is in the action. And the goal or the outcome is entirely dictated by the force of the action. I don't know if there's a technical term for this type of framework or belief system. Maybe it's called faith-oriented thinking. Maybe it's called orthodoxy. And it's why, in my opinion, in Eastern Orthodoxy, so much of religious thought is about the continuation of actions repetitively. It's about tradition. This is a very different way of thinking than what I think has become the norm in today's society. But I do believe we are seeing more and more and more examples of how this type of thinking is starting to pick up more steam and have a bigger effect on the overall happiness of people. My business makes more money by focusing on the consistency of its actions day in, day out. I would say in my experiences of the past 10 years, I have watched that shift between this mentality and this mentality play out in small businesses in this country. It's very clear to me. The goal of I want to lose 20 pounds is not the same thing as a goal of saying I want to eat healthier. If I focus on what I eat and how I engage in physical activity as opposed to focusing on obtaining a goal, you're scientifically proven to be more likely to meet your goal. Abram was already in Canaan before God told him why God sent him to Canaan. The God of the Euphrates in Haran would never reveal Abram to leave Haran. So the text identifies the God that tells Abram to leave Haran as the God as having been the God to tell him to leave Haran. And you see that through the text. It comes up often. But even then, Abraham doesn't experience the result of his actions. He just does it. Isaac is the one that experiences the results. So whatever the purpose in God's revelation to Abraham was to leave Haran was not for Abraham's sake, but actually for Isaac's sake. And so the result is multi-generational. So from a historical point of view, I want you to think about this. Can we retroactively, using scientific methods, determine the belief, actions, and goals of a given person? What can we do and use to determine the outcomes, actions, and beliefs of people that no longer exist? Is this something that's even possible to do? This picture actually has to do with this issue. And we're getting closer and closer to discussing these matters and what it has to do with the text. And so with that, we're done for the night. I apologize if this went long. Not yet. If I tell you now, it won't make sense. We're getting there. I will say this much. When we get to Moses at Sinai is when we will talk about this. So I'm trying to lead up to a thing that is the foundational thing. It's the entire thing that makes Judaism what Judaism is, and is what makes Christianity what Christianity is. Not this, but what this is about. Okay. This is an issue of archaeology, and it taps into the question I just asked: is can we retroactively, using scientific methods, determine the beliefs, actions, and goals of a person? That's the question. So tonight we're done. Thank you, everybody. I hope this was helpful. So.